on this. We do have the chat open, so if there's questions that come up during the presentation, by all means, feel free to enter them into the chat. And once again, good evening. My name is Quinn Gardner, Deputy Director of Emergency Management. I'm joined by Councilmember Bushy, Project Manager Mary Skramstad, and Senior Traffic Engineer Lauren Deviney, to talk specifically about what we're trying to do to make sure we're keeping our evacuation routes and all of our roadways safe for emergency access, and the impact that has on clarifying parking in these areas. So tonight's presentation is going to include a little bit about the background on the project and how we got here, as well as we're going to specifically talk about our initial pilot project, cover our outreach process, and then we'll go over, Lauren will cover some of the specific parking rules and standards. Mary's going to go over step by step how we reached, right, the information that we reached, and the decisions that we reached. We'll go over some specific additional public works considerations. We'll talk about some alternatives to what we're proposing, and then we'll dive into Q&A. And the Q&A is going to start with kind of an FAQ and the most common questions we get asked. And then we'll go into broader questions. And then at the end, we'll handle any street specific questions, just to try to make sure that folks get the broadest picture first. And then if people need to jump off while we dive into street specific questions, that'll be the last thing we touch on this evening. So without further ado, here's one of many timelines and consolidated timelines that kind of outlines all the things the city's been doing as it relates to wildfire prevention. So going back, it actually even into the 90s is when we adopted some different building codes, but 2007 is when we really started taking a look at vegetation. Our last update of the hazard mitigation plan started around 2017. And then it was after the North Bay fires that City Council at the time, or the City Council at the time, directed us to be bold and to do everything we could to make sure that San Rafael wasn't the next Coffee Park or Santa Rosa or anything like that. And so we've been working really hard on that ever since. We spent about 2 years drafting what ended up being a 38-point action plan that covers a variety of ways we're adapting the city to wildfire, everything from vegetation management, home hardening, evacuation improvements, staffing, open space management, all sorts of good things. And so one of those items was specifically how we could clarify our parking, specifically on our narrow hilly roads where we have some challenges. And that is the part that we took to council in 2021 that specifically adopted an amendment that allowed us, in addition to the standard 6 foot from parking rule, to include additional markings that would allow us to better clarify for everybody where it was safe to park while still allowing for emergency access, as well as resident and egress. So that's kind of how we got here. That's a nutshell. Those 2 years of developing that action plan involved a Citizens Wildfire Advisory Committee that had people from every neighborhood. It involved a lot of community input, a lot of great discussions, and actually Councilmember Bushy was our co-chair on that committee with former Mayor Phillips. And so she's definitely been involved with this since early in the process, and we're into this place now. So the first place, or the reason why this parking becomes so important, and we'll see if this video is going to work for me. It did earlier today. This is one of our very typical San Rafael streets that has folks parked on both sides. And what I want you to do is we watch this video, and I'm just going to mute it. It's just the engineer talking to the firefighter that had to get out of the cab. Imagine that you're the house this engine is on its way to, either because it is literally on fire or because of a medical emergency or anything else. And in order to navigate these streets, the engine had to stop, have firefighters get out into the roadway, which of course is dangerous for them, make alterations to the vehicles, popping in the mirrors. And you can see how tight, especially with the way that that black truck tire is turned, how close that bumper is. I'm like super impressed by our engineer at this point in getting this engine through here. And now what's even scarier to imagine to some extent is imagine you're the house, maybe you're the house we can see just to the left or just to the right, that is on fire and needs medical attention. that engine cannot operate in this environment, right? Those doors don't open, the compartments don't open, the ladders can't come out, the hoses can't come out and function. So this particular part of the street not only is slowing down that emergency response, right, to somewhere else on the street, as an example, but literally the engine cannot do what it is supposed to do because of the way the parking is happening on this street. So this is just one visual of kind of why this is such an important project. And we'll dive into more of that as we go through this.
And
Go ahead, Mary.
it also puts our firefighters in danger when they have to exit the engine and direct traffic.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you imagine this being an actual major wildfire scenario, right? Now anybody trying to get out can't get out, right? Because that engine's completely blocking the street, poor visibility, et cetera. So those aren't the situations we want. And we aren't in a position to want to just rely on luck and timing as we navigate these. Great point, thank you. So as we've moved through this project, and actually this might answer some of the questions that have popped up in the chat. What I'll do is I'll do my section of the presentation, then I'll review the chat as Lauren and Mary do theirs, and then we'll come back to answer some of this as well. But we started with San Rafael Lincoln Hill as our initial pilot project for a couple of different reasons. One, it's a narrow, narrow roads, hilly streets, and it's also got a significant fire history. We just responded to a fire there within the last year. There was one about 4 years ago. So we started with extensive outreach, either door-to-door knocks, working with neighborhood associations, et cetera. Before we've done any parking modifications, we've gone through and we've completed the roadside vegetation work. And so we've done this in the hopes that if we can trim back, we're doing it for two reasons. One, we don't want the vegetation right along the roadway because that could create dangers during an evacuation if it was on fire. But we've also went and moved the vegetation first in hopes that maybe we could see the street maybe had a foot of pavement left and there was overgrown vegetation, or we could somehow create wider streets by removing that vegetation. And in some cases that certainly helped. The vegetation has been completed across the city for this year, the roadside vegetation removal. So there's still some ongoing maintenance, obviously, will happen, and some larger tree removal, but overall, we've been able to complete a lot of that evacuation route improvement through roadside. So then we've moved into these this parking clarification project is what I've liked to start calling it. So one of the first things we did too was go to the engines. We went to the engineers and the people that drive our streets every day, that come to your homes, to your schools, right, to your places of business to help you when you're in need, and said, where do you struggle? And based on that feedback, that helped us again pick San Rafael Lincoln Hill, but it also helped narrow down the streets and has contributed in the information for as we move through these other neighborhoods. We also took resident feedback and continue to take resident feedback throughout the entire process. I think just last week, Mary and Lauren were back up on San Rafael Hill, tweaking a few parking boxes based on resident feedback. They actually didn't want them initially, and now they want them installed. And so we're going to go back and assuming the measurements come out correctly, help them do that. So San Rafael Lincoln Hill, we installed parking boxes, and we've got a visual to help you understand that here in a minute. And as well as signage. In other areas, if it's made more sense to install signage, and we've communicated that via direct mailing to the impacted addresses, as well as initial markings. And then we get the calls and say, why are these markings on my street? And then we can explain that. And then again, we've used the engines multiple phases in the process. And we've started holding community meetings now as well. So it's really been a case-by-case review, street by street, really on the ground assessment of how to do that. And that's in addition to all the outreach that's happened through the Wildfire Action Plan, through the initial advisory committee, all of our community meetings leading up to the adoption of the action plan, ongoing social media. And again, we've directly mailed letters. I have heard from residents. I don't look at my mail. I don't open things from the city, et cetera, which is why we've tried to work with neighborhood associations and things like that as best we can. But sometimes it is the paint on the curb that gets people's attention. So whatever way we can reach you, we want to have those conversations so that we can make sure we're finding the safest but most palatable, if you will, decision. So here's a parking box example. I believe this is again San Rafael Lincoln Hill. And what a parking box is essentially it can be any length as long as it's safe, but it designates specifically where a vehicle can be. And it's all based on the city's existing and long-standing rule that you cannot park within the 6 feet of the center line. But that is confusing for folks. No one's getting out and figuring out the middle of a road and trying to find what 6 feet is from it, right? And it's really hard for parking enforcement to enforce. And that's how we end up like situations where you saw with that engine that could barely fit through. So we're taking that existing rule and we're trying to clarify it and implement it in ways that are easier for folks to understand, easier for us to enforce, all with the intent of keeping our community safe. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Lauren here for the next couple slides.
Thank you, Quinn. Some of the minimum roadway widths or vehicle widths and parking spot widths are listed here. So our fire department requests an 11-foot travel lane per direction. Parking spots, if you're downtown where we have the luxury of a little bit more width on, say, 4th Street, we do, 8-foot spots, but where we're dealing with more narrow roadways, we've gone down to 7 feet. There's a turning radius that we have to be mindful of. So a fire engine has a much greater turning radius than a small compact car, and they navigate turns. They just take more space to do that. Per the fire code, the minimum width of a road for new construction is 20 feet. And then the last thing we're looking at is we need 20 feet of, we do 20 feet of red curb approaching intersections. And that's so you can see a pedestrian crossing the street, whether there's a crosswalk or not. All intersection of 2 streets is a crossing, and it also helps open up some space. So when 2 cars do meet at an intersection, they have space to move through. I can talk about this one too. So there's an assortment of options. When I think this program started, it was, okay, we're going to go ahead with parking boxes everywhere. But as Mary did the evaluation for streets, we found that some streets were better suited for parking boxes. Some streets are better suited for restricting parking on one side, and by doing that with red curb or with signage. And then another one to consider is the vehicle size and height limitations. We have that where we have problems with like RVs parking. So we say, we don't want tall cars at this intersection. That's like really, but you could have like a shorter compact car. So trying to be mindful and accommodate on-street parking wherever we can. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And I'd add with this is we're trying to do what will either create or maintain as much safe and legal parking as possible, that is as easy to understand as possible. And so we'll implement whichever one of these things kind of makes sense based on that individual street or even block by block to some extent. So I think Mary's going to cover the next few.
Yes, so I'm covering some of the steps we took in order to evaluate the circumstances. The first step was identifying the streets that were narrow on hillsides and have limited egress. So if we identified that there are a lot of vehicles and the roads would not be able to accommodate all of the vehicles, then we had to make changes in order to make sure everybody can get out safely in a timely manner. Next slide. The second step was interviewing the fire crews. So we actually sent out a survey and we talked to a lot of the fire crews and the engines operators, and we asked them, where in the city do you have problems with making turns? Where do you have problems with getting through? And where have you seen that your firefighters have to get out and direct the driver because you're going to hit a car? Here's another example of another area in our city where the firefighter has to come out in order to direct traffic. So on the bends, we have to consider that the radius of the fire engine is wider than a car, like Lauren said. Next slide. The third step we took was looking at the data instead of measuring first, we took data from Marin County, and we used that data to identify the streets that were narrower. And if anybody's interested in looking at this data, it's on the county website, and I'm happy to share it. Next slide. So the fourth step was actually going out and measuring each road. On the left, on the left is Chief Sinnott, Deputy Fire Chief, and I'm on the right. He's holding a 12-foot PVC pipe that is portraying the fire engine, and I'm holding a 7-foot PVC pipe that is illustrating a parking box. So we walked the streets and we saw where they could both fit easily. If they overlapped, then we would not be able to add parking. This was very manual, and we did walk every single road in order to determine where to put a parking box, or if the road could accommodate parking on one side or the other. Next slide.
Mary, and I do want to credit Mary, Chief Sinnott, Lauren, I think a couple other folks from DPW and fire. This has been a very intensive process, and I think this image really encapsulates how customized we tried to be with this, in terms of really getting on the ground and measuring that. And we'll actually show you why that measuring pipes are so important here in a couple slides.
So along with step 4, we had to analyze the characteristics of the streets and look at how much space is actually needed. So we looked at the 6 foot from the center, and we look at the minimum width of a car or the parking spot, which is 7 feet. And we came up with the schematic to identify the places where we can and cannot put parking. So if the road is 20 feet, then that doesn't leave enough space, that barely leaves enough space for 20, if the road is wider than 20 feet, then there's space for one parking box or one parking on one side. And when we want parking on both sides, as you saw in that image where the engine was struggling, we need at least 17 feet in order for the fire engine to be able to open the doors. Now, the minimum width for the engine to travel, to only move, is 12 feet. But if we want the engine to be able to operate, pull down hoses, pull down the ladder, then they need more space, especially if they need to equip like a SCBA, which is like an oxygen tank. So if they need to enter a building on fire, they need to be able to put on an oxygen tank and put all the equipment. In order to do that, they need the space. They need to open their doors. There will not be time to call the owners of the vehicles to get them to move the vehicle. And if they're out of town, then we're out of luck. So we definitely need the space to be clear.
What I think is really impactful about this too is if we go back to the existing 6 feet from center rule, right? So 6 feet from center maintains 12 feet. So in order for a vehicle to park and not be 6 feet from center, you'd have to have, right, 12 feet plus 6 feet on either side, which realistically should be 7, but at its absolute minimum is 6 feet on that parking, which is actually, right, 24 feet. And so we're actually creating legal parking through this process, because that second line down, we actually, by the 6 feet from center rule, parking would not be allowed, right? Because that vehicle would be within potentially 12 feet of, or 6 feet of the center line. But by saying, well, we're going to allow parking on one side, we can maintain that access path while also permitting legal parking. And I do just want to address one question. I think Mary addressed this, but we'll have some questions come up in terms of the difference between 11 and 12, et cetera. One, our engines do vary in width, company mirrors and other things. But there's also where, like, if it's, if it shrinks down to 11 for maybe just a foot or two, it might be something that we can tolerate. But if the entire length of a road or an extended section gets down into that super narrow area, then it's not something that we could tolerate, because the engine can't navigate, it can't operate. And it's not just about the engine, right? We've got trash trucks, delivery drivers, moving vehicles, all sorts of stuff. But obviously that engine is how we keep people safe.
Thank you, Quinn.
So here, Mary, real quick, I'll just jump in here. So this is, I think, maybe helps visualize it. So that's the same piping, right? And so you can see the engine mirrors in the width as well as the ambulance. And I think it's important to think about the ambulance too, because even though the ambulance is a little more narrow, the ambulance needs to operate out of its side compartments, right? And needs to be able to open those doors. And once those doors are open, it really is taking up that width. And any one of these vehicles could have to stop anywhere in the roadway based on, right, that address that called in. So this is kind of that visual representation of how the sticks play in regard to these particular apparatus. But again, we have apparatus of different sizes. Here's the SCBA Mary mentioned in terms of the pullout, right? So that's a couple feet they need. At least these ladders come out, again, a couple feet in addition to what you were seeing in that previous picture. So in this picture, all you're seeing is the engine bay itself. And in this picture, that's in addition to that width is space they need to operate. So a firefighter needs to be able to stand by the engine, pull out that SCBA and put it on safely without falling off a hillside or, you know, swinging it into another vehicle to be able to operate.
And if you go back, you can see the hose connectors are right there. They require 3 feet. The hose comes out 3 feet and bends in order to connect.
Great, thanks, Mary. Continue.
Yeah, so what we did was observe the existing parking patterns, and we accounted for blind curves and blind spots. We looked at the oil grease stains on the ground to see where people were parking. We looked at driveways so that people can safely back up from their driveways. We did consider the evacuation direction. We also knocked on doors whenever we thought we needed more input. And we did meet with residents one-on-one who responded to the letters. And whenever they responded, if we're able to make adjustments, we did. And if we got input such as on Oakmont, the residents let me know that they'd prefer to park on the other side because there's a sidewalk. And so that's what we did. We switched it over to the other side because there's a sidewalk. Same with Dominican. I got feedback that they prefer to park on the side with the sidewalk. So we're gonna change it. So the changes will be on the side with the sidewalk so that people don't step onto lawns or have a drop off or you know, for ADA compliance as well, they can go straight to the sidewalk. If there are other adjustments that we can make, we will look at them and further evaluate. We definitely take everybody's feedback seriously because we do not live in these neighborhoods. Yeah, Oakdale. Thank you for the correction, Oakdale. I also live in San Rafael. So at the end of the day, we're trying to build community resiliency here so that everybody is able to evacuate if there is an evacuation order. So if people are able to provide feedback on blind curves and turns that they're not able to see each other, or drop-offs where they prefer not to be able to park because they've already been injured, these are things that we would like to know so that we can prevent further injuries and further catastrophes. Next slide. So after we went out and looked at that, on certain streets, we did add parking boxes. Here's Glen Park, the Glen Park area. We marked the boxes on the ground, and then we had the engine drive by. The firefighters are standing where the parking boxes are, and they give the final word whether they're able to safely drive through and operate. So like in this case, we had to remove parking on one side because there was not enough room. We did receive feedback from the residents and from the original letter, and residents agreed that they prefer parking boxes because it's clearer and it's easier to understand than looking for all the signs. So we went out, we did further analysis, we received all the input on the blind corners, blind curves, and any other safety issues that they had, and we went out and marked them in orange paint. So look out for a letter. We are going to send out another letter to explain the paint. If you didn't get a letter, we are going to send out letters for those who didn't attend.
Thanks, Mary. And on that note, I think we had a question earlier about we have updated the website recently with an updated list based on resident feedback. So again, this is an evolving process. So at any given point in time, I won't promise the list on the website is 100% accurate, but we did just update that. So there are a couple of street changes in there that are the most current, but again, nothing has been installed at this point, and tests like this continue. So yes, to the latest question, yes, there are opportunities for adjustments, assuming we can continue to meet our goal of safety.
Correct. So that said, the tentative schedule for another drive-through, not all of them have gotten a drive-through, only the streets that are getting parking boxes have gotten a drive-through. So there's going to be an official complete drive-through. On the 31st, it's going to be the north and the west. And on June 2nd is going to be South Dominican. So keep your eye out for the engine. Starting at 5:30, they're going to be driving through every single street in this particular order, the same order as the table. I'll be driving behind them and taking photos as needed, but feel free to come out and watch and observe and ask questions if you have any questions. Next slide. Oh, I did want to mention that if there is an emergency and the engine has to leave, they will leave and we will have to reschedule.
Thanks, Mary. Real quick, there were a couple kind of themed questions, if you will. We'll leave the dates of the drive-through, May 31st for North and West and June 2nd for South. And that's still up on that slide in that bottom corner for those of you that can't see the screen share. And again, this presentation will be available as well afterwards, and we can also share it with the neighborhood association to send out if that's helpful. There was a kind of a couple of themed questions. One, sidewalks versus parking. We would be open to entertaining the idea if there's a majority of a neighborhood that wants to eliminate a sidewalk. There's access issues, ADA issues, access to public transit. So there's a variety of factors there that would need to get considered. It is not a quick solution. It's certainly something that we can explore over time. With that, and then I think the second question was kind of why now, essentially, like we've lived like this forever, and there's a variety of reasons. One, again, we've had really significant weather and fire patterns we've seen it changing over the last decade, but certainly over the last 5 years, even more significantly. So fire conditions are getting worse. Our risk from a wildfire is worse. That is scientifically proven, in fact. And in addition, we're seeing larger vehicles, generally speaking. We're seeing a lot of homes with more vehicles than they used to have. So as parking becomes more dense, these challenges are getting worse. And we have had other issues. I saw a comment earlier where someone said, why is the engine dealing with the problem? We had a moving truck stuck up on a road a couple months ago that required heavy towing because it couldn't make a turn. And part of that was the obstructions in the roadway. So it's not just the vehicles. The other side of this is just a couple months ago, we had an emergency response in San Rafael Lincoln Hill that was exceptionally aided. Both the residents and the firefighters that went to that call noted the changing and the clarifications in the parking as one of the reasons that they were able to safely respond to that call and assist the person that was injured. So there are a variety of factors there as to why now is the time. And we'll talk about enforcement here towards the end of the presentation. I see a lot of questions coming in about that. Lauren, I think you have the next few slides.
Awesome, thank you. Some of the other things that we consider from a public works perspective that plays into this is again that 20-foot clearance as you're approaching an intersection. So you just want to make sure sight lines are totally clear through an intersection, watching for pedestrians or another vehicle trying to navigate through at the same time. And I just kind of went through all the bullet points there. So where red curb is being shown in these two examples, one is on Mountain View and one is on Jewel, I think, is just because it's at an intersection and visibility through there is very important to maintain. So we're just bringing it up to current standards. These are standards in the California MUTCD that says, you need to have red curb approaching an intersection or parking restrictions approaching an intersection. Next slide. This is an intersection at Jewel and Palm, and again, I think it's a three-legged intersection, but again, we just want to make sure you can accommodate two-way traffic through an intersection. So one person's leaving, maybe a fire truck is coming in, and maintaining visibility for the pedestrians. And then Mary's let me know that there's been some feedback about pedestrian safety. So some solutions to consider. Sounds like I'm reading the chat. Sounds like maybe I shouldn't recommend the sidewalk repair program, but there are locations where there is no sidewalk on either side of the street and people are unfortunately walking in the street. So that's something to consider. If there's no sidewalk at all, that might be something that's added to the bike and pedestrian master plan as a new project to sidewalk gap closure. There's been anecdotally, oh, we're going to remove parking on one side of the street. We think speeds will go up. We would want to collect speed surveys, and that we do with this like stealth radar. And so it collects speeds. It doesn't involve like a cop with a radar gun or anything. So we get really good data that we can use to share with the police department. One, if there's really a problem, we can share with the police department. It says, hey, there is a trend of speeding at 3 p.m. maybe when the kids are getting out of school. Can you please spend an hour enforcing that on the weekdays? Other things we can do within public works and maintenance is doing like speed pavement legends to remind people what the speed limit is on a roadway. Again, red curbing for visibility. And as I mentioned, police enforcement. Next slide.
Thanks, Lauren. So I see a couple questions coming up in the chat, and I hope some of these alternatives might address kind of what people are thinking about. So there's a few different things, and the first thing I would say, and this is a lot of text, what this really gets at it. Part of when we adopted the plan and when we adopted the actual ordinance for the parking boxes was that we will do everything we can to work with somebody that is trying to create more off-street parking. So in some cases, there might be existing code that limits how much of your lot you have to keep natural or things like that. We are going to work with everybody, especially if there's any type of ADA issue, but ideally we want to create more off-street parking, right? Roads are public right-of-ways and public thoroughfares, not parking lots. And it's really important we're doing everything we can to maintain roadways. Most of these roads were designed to be 2 ways and are basically functioning as one-way streets once they're fully parked on either side. So this is one option, and this is probably going to be more for individuals that want to create more off-street parking, but we want you to know this is an option for you. Another option is there is a residential parking permit policy that exists at the city. It does require a minimum of 1,500 residents to participate, and does need to have a 2/3 vote of those residents or be supported by 2/3 of those residents. And so if folks are concerned about people parking in their neighborhood from out of the area or things like that, this is an option. It has not been implemented anywhere in the city, to my knowledge, to date. And it needs to be a big number. Whether 1,500 is the right number or something, I know we've had some discussions with some residents about, but it can't be 10 or 20 or 30 houses because that essentially privatizes a road. So it needs to be a neighborhood, right? If this is something that we wanted to explore. This doesn't necessarily mean that the parking laws change, right? You're still not allowed to park 6 feet from center, but potentially you'd be looking at less out of area parking that might free up more parking for residents. Another option is, and we have done this in the canal, is time limits on how long you can be parked in a street. So that kind of forces people to move vehicles. So it really becomes more of a, this is where I park at night when I'm home, and it's not like a vehicle that I'm leaving there for weeks or months on end. There's of course enforcement issues here. And just something as simple as going on vacation for a week could create challenges. So it's an option that's in the toolbox. It's not something we're really recommending for the goal we're trying to get to, which is the safety. But it is another thing we want folks to be aware of if that's something that you think could be beneficial. Again, it can't be it has to be at a kind of a neighborhood level. So those are some of those alternatives. And I'm gonna, before I open it up to additional questions, I'm gonna try to hit anything else that was in the chat. I saw earlier on there were some questions about the outreach as a whole. We did mail letters to every address that was on a road that was impacted. Mary, do you remember how many letters that was off the top of your head?
985.
Okay. So we have some follow-up letters going out. We have worked directly with the neighborhood association, and I know they've helped blast out our information as well. So I apologize if some of that missed you. Again, this process is still in flux. We're still working on sorting these other things out in the details. So we're still open to those conversations. Mary is your best point of contact for any specific requests or considerations or site visits that might be necessary. I believe her email is at the end of the presentation, or she'll certainly be able to put it in the chat. The enforcement question has come up, so I'll just quickly address that. So what we've done in other areas is we have a 30 to 60-day warning period where we're not ticketing or producing any revenue, but our parking services are out educating residents about what the changes that have taken place and that you need to be parking in these safe and legal spots. And then when we have either repeat offenders or after we get outside of that warning window, there would be a ticketing process. We really certainly want to avoid towing at all costs. However, especially on red flag days, and especially for priority evacuation routes or access routes, that's again a tool in the toolbox, but not necessarily something that we want to be getting out if we can avoid it. So parking services, we've worked closely with them on this project. They've already implemented it on San Rafael Lincoln Hill. We are to the point of having to write tickets, and I do not believe they're in a position where they have to write many tickets at all. And we've had some folks again ask for changes and everything else. I think there was a question about kind of, I don't want to say selective targeting, but this is a citywide initiative. Again, we're working through the areas of biggest risk that the engines have provided the most feedback with, things like that. So we've worked with the West End, as well as some of our downtown neighborhoods, as well as San Rafael Lincoln Hill. We're now in Dominican Black Canyon. And then I believe, Mary, you're already in the process in Bret Harte and what's your other neighborhood that's on next?
Picnic Valley.
Picnic, thank you. So this is not a selective, we're just phasing this in and working our way through. Some of that was based on where we had to do the roadside vegetation work. And then again, based on those risks and other factors. So I think that covers the bulk of that. So does anyone have questions about the evaluation process specifically? So I saw a question come in about population density, average number of vehicles compared to parking spaces. Not a specific feasibility. Again, I think this is where some of these alternatives become key, and why this process is necessary is we are seeing what might have been a 2-car household is now a 4-car household. It's not on us to say whether or not how many cars a household can have. It is our responsibility to maintain the public right-of-ways and maintain the public accesses. And so those roads are not designed to be parking lots, right? Street parking is a benefit. It's not necessarily a right in a lot of these places. And so if folks have converted their garages or their garages are full for storage and they're not able to use their garage, that doesn't mean that the street is necessarily their right to park on if that interferes with public safety. So I completely understand the density challenges. Certainly the state laws also create some challenges when we get into ADUs and our ability to limit or not limit them. But we are focused on this public safety aspect. And certainly through this process, I hope more people will use their driveways or create alternative parking options. I'll give you one example. We were working West End, I believe, near an apartment complex, and we're initially kind of in a parallel parking structure, right? Just typical what you think of when you think of on-street parking. But there was actually enough width in the roadway that we could look at doing 45-degree angle spots. And so with that, we were able to add a couple extra spots that could still be safely used while maintaining that public roadway, as I believe the two-way street it was designed to be. So we'll be as creative as we possibly can to get you as much safe and legal parking as possible, but we have to maintain these public roadways. We don't want to run into evacuation challenges. We need our engines and our ambulances to be able to respond to our community as quickly and safely as possible. And we need that when they're responding, right, they're not completely blocking roadways where people can't do their normal business in or out. We have started conversations with the high school. We certainly recognize that's a unique challenge for particularly some of the neighborhoods here.
I have
And
more information.
go ahead, Mary.
So I spoke to the school district, and they let me know that the construction is almost complete, to the point that they're going to be removing the construction on the front parking lot, opening it to students. And they're also removing the construction in the back of the school and opening another 150 parking spots. So I'm hoping that that kind of resolves the situation. They do not charge their students for the parking permit, so I'm hoping that also encourages students to park in the student parking lot. If the problem does persist, feel free to reach out and we can start that conversation up again. But I'm hoping that because of the construction ending, that should resolve that issue.
Thanks, Mary. Sure, I'm trying to squeeze through this really quick. I'm seeing a lot more kind of how do we change things questions than process questions or specific street questions. There is enforcement ongoing, and there's always a learning curve there. We saw it with Sanderfell Lincoln Hill kind of as our pilot. The first couple of weeks were rough, but with those warnings, folks really got it. And like I said, we've actually added some parking boxes where people initially didn't want them or things like that. Are we willing to remove sidewalks? I think that's a very big question. We are open to entertaining the idea. It is not going to be a short-term solution, so it might be something where we need to red curb something in the meantime to keep that public safety aspect while we go through a public process to determine if removing a sidewalk. And in some cases too, there's easement issues and widening the streets could be going into someone's private property. So it's unfortunately not quite as simple as the city just making a decision to remove that. I see some questions coming up again about delivery drivers and things like that. So we're going to cover that in the FAQs that are coming up. So it might be better if I run through that and then I'll try to get back into the chat. And if you feel like your question was a long time ago and didn't get addressed, please feel free to throw it back in. You can see how many questions are coming in, so we're doing our best to keep up. So some of the typical FAQs we've gotten is what is considered off-street parking. And so I think these kind of illustrate it. This top left and, to be fair, the bottom right are perfect examples of how you can create some off-street parking, just a small retaining wall and some gravel or something like that, where you might be able to create some additional parking, and this is considered off-street. Whereas the image on the right with the big red X, this is not off-street. This is a complete violation of parking. And then in this case particularly too, it actually forced a passing vehicle to go over a double yellow line on a bend, extremely dangerous. Also dangerous for this vehicle, who is now, any passenger is getting out down a hillside into bushes. So this is not what we want to see on the right. On the left is what we would consider off-street parking. So can you park on the sidewalk as is? No. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One, sidewalks are designed for people to walk on. They're also what folks that use wheelchairs or folks that are pushing strollers or their grocery bag carts or anything like that need. So parking on the sidewalk is not allowed. This will be enforced. And please don't park on the sidewalk. And you can see the code behind that supports why the answer to that question is no. This is the enforcement question. Mary, do you want to cover this slide?
Yes. So as we mentioned, there are always going to be we're going to be making adjustments wherever possible. So we understand that if we put restrictions on one street, that the cars might be moved to a different street and they're going to cause problems on a different street. So we completely understand that. Again, we're not doing it on every single street because we're looking at where the problems are currently. But if problems persist on different streets, we will happily analyze and see how we can better the situation. So here, this picture is somebody created their own parking on their property. They made it 6 feet, perfect for their vehicle. There's enough space in between and there's no parking on the other side. So this perfectly portrays that there's parking on one side of the street while maintaining access in the middle. To date, we have received 10 requests or over 10 requests in Dominican, and I have gone out and met with people one-on-one. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to meet one-on-one with you and discuss your particular street. In my emails in the chat, and I'll add it.
Thanks, Mary. Tell Nick we say hi. So the maintenance question, this has come up as we mentioned permits for kind of temporary. So the one question that came up was actually, well, what if, like in this case, right, a vehicle is blocking an entire lane, they're parked here. They have a traffic person there that's maintaining traffic flow. The other thing with this is these vehicles are staffed. So if they needed to move right outside of this particular vehicle has the supports down, and it would take a minute to get those. But if that vehicle needs moved because of an evacuation or anything else, they can immediately move. So one of the challenges with the neighborhood permitting process is exactly that, like your visitors, your gardeners, your cleaners, whoever it may be, wouldn't necessarily have permits. Delivery trucks are generally in and out. And again, if someone's with that vehicle, they're not necessarily going to be in a position to be ticketed as long as it can be moved immediately. But if they're parked in a legal parking spot, it's not an issue. And in some cases, the recommendation too might be if you know you have a construction project underway, maybe if you can move your vehicle onto a legal street parking spot and your construction vehicle could use your driveway if it's too big for a parking box, or you want to assure it can be nearby or something like that. So we recognize, again, there's definitely some inconvenience with this, but our ultimate goal is public safety. And so kind of to, I think it's Jim's, I'm trying to go back up here, and I know there's like 20 new questions that have come in. Will street parking be collectively reduced? My honest feeling is legal parking is not being reduced. I think what people perceive as legal parking is being reduced. But if we were enforcing our 6 feet from center rules as is, which is very time intensive, involves measuring tapes, etc., a lot of people are parking illegally today. So we're actually trying to create more legal parking through this process by doing the roadside vegetation first, and all the things we can. And the nice thing with the parking boxes too is if you've got a bunch of small vehicles, you might be able to fit 3 or 4 vehicles in that parking box. If it's a larger vehicle, it might be less. And so in terms of providing feedback, again, the one-on-one, Mary and Lauren will go out and have those conversations and look at how it can be evaluated. We'll involve our deputy chief if needed, or an engine or whatever the case may be. So I think that answers that question. Are you addressing houses with walls or fences or vegetation right up to the street? Assuming there's no other permitting or code violation, that's not necessarily an issue. The vegetation right up to the street we have addressed through the vegetation program. It would depend on the type of vegetation, but there's setback rules for fences and things like that that would be more of our building department. But if there's a concern there, a specific concern, we're happy to explore it. There might be some inconsistencies on the roads. As you know, a lot of them ebb and flow in their width as well. So while we use Marin maps as our initial starting point, that's why we went out and ground truthed everything. So the specific question about Oakdale, it might be 22 feet at one point, 26 at another, could be 21 somewhere, and 28. They do kind of ebb and flow that way. And then some of that depends even on what you're considering the end of the road. And we're not just counting the pavement as the end of the road. If there's gravel or a safe shoulder to park on, that could be incorporated and help us create more peace there. If you feel you have a legitimate objection, again, Mary will work with you one-on-one. If it needs to get elevated to me or our deputy fire chief, we'll do that. But again, we're trying to clarify and enforce existing laws. So that's our focus there. Violation of parking frequently on the sidewalk area. Appreciate that feedback. I think I answered that question. So it's not 31. So again, the 31 feet on both sides is, our goal is to create safe travel lanes that meet legal standards and to maintain as much legal parking as possible. And in some cases, we are making exceptions to our own code to create more legal parking. So I'm not sure exactly what your question is, or when it comes to the 30 feet. But we are looking at this across the city. But again, starting in those hilly streets, our biggest fire risk areas first. Limited enforcement on house vegetation. Vegetation management enforcement is starting very shortly. We've seen a ton of progress. We've seen a ton of people move to compliance. Resources exist there. I'm happy to connect with anyone specific to vegetation or defensible space issues, but just want to be respectful of the goal of this meeting. Alternative egress prior to reaching out. So one of the things that the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority Board just passed was an evacuation study for the entire county, which we're hoping we're going to be ahead of the curve on some of this. And certainly that feedback might end up with us needing to make more changes. And one of the things it's going to do is identify roads where some type of like heavier duty construction is necessary. So whether that's a one-way street that might need a whole second road built, but those are going to be obviously big projects. You're talking about easements, land acquisition, all sorts of things, paving, et cetera. Or it could be something as simple as an intersection where the traffic flow is bad and it might need to go to a different type. So that study is underway, which will address some of those bigger type construction projects, which I hope answers the question regarding Grand Avenue from Ralph. Mary, can you see the question from Dawn specifically about 316 to 331 Jewel? And Dawn, if you can email Mary, she can get back to you specifically. There might have been some changes there.
Yes, I can just say it very briefly. We're looking at doing a little bit of a change there. So somewhat of staggered parking to accommodate everybody. So we're going to look at how to better look at that street. So feel free to email me and give me more input so that we can still maintain access while also making sure that people have parking. But we're trying to find a solution there.
Okay. And Mary, there's a specific comment from you from Bob Levine as well, that I think he's asking for a site visit.
Yes. I was waiting for the truck to be back from maintenance.
Totally get it.
And I have looked at Union, and we will be addressing Union. However, right now we need to come up with creative solutions because that street is definitely a problem. But again, we are looking into what solutions we can come up there. It's not a one size fits all. I want to really specify that every single street is very different, not only with the width, but also with the characterization, the bends, the vegetation, the homes, the driveways. So the solutions are all nuanced. It's a completely nuanced approach that we have to take for every single street and looking at all different perspectives. So I really appreciate everybody's patience with this, as I don't remember every single street, and we definitely have to look at all the streets in a different lens.
Thanks. And I think that addresses Tom and Hannah's question. But like when you're looking at a 26-foot road, to have vehicles parked on both sides is at a minimum 12 feet. So we can look at that specific area. And again, that's where some of that we might be able to red curb the narrowest section of the road and leave the bulk of the road. The other thing we're looking at too is in some cases, it's not necessarily no vehicle can fit, it's the type of vehicle and how that vehicle is parked, which is the benefit of the parking boxes, because you're either in or out of the parking box, or even looking at options where we might just be putting like a line straight down a road. And as long as you're on the curb side of that line, you're legally parked. But if you have too big of a vehicle or you poorly parked and you came on the other side of that road line, you'd be illegally parked because of how close that would come and what that would mean to that right of way. But again, I think it's also important to remember that these streets are designed in most cases to be two-way. And so when we're looking at large sections of road where we're saying you can park on both sides, we're essentially creating one-way streets. And we need to be really cognizant of what that traffic flow pattern is, what the curb visibility is, what the pedestrian safety is, and some of those other things Lauren mentioned. So this other question came up in terms of evacuation routes. And and just that we do a lot with evacuation. I know Dominican, we did an evacuation drill pre-pandemic, so I guess it was 2018. I think that was really great. We'd love to see those happen again. We've got a lot of great resources with our community emergency response team, Firewise. I know Dominican Black Canyon is a Firewise neighborhood. Sorry if I'm missing anybody else on this call that's in a Firewise neighborhood. So a lot of great resources that can all help with evacuation. Of course, we need everybody to be signed up for Alert Marin so that you can know as soon as possible and you can take action as soon as possible. So this is one piece of the evacuation. We've got a ton of vegetation projects happening. We just got another project done on the northern side of Dominican, creating some additional fuel breaks there. We've done a lot of work around the fire roads, kind of looping around the canyon. All of this trying to prevent ignitions through our Ranger program and our smoking reduction efforts. So this is one piece of the puzzle, but it's obviously a very important piece. And we've heard that from residents for years, right? Concerned about evacuation and things like that. Unfortunately, making these evacuation improvements changes the way people are used to parking, but it is necessary for the safety of the community. We've gotten this question specifically is, can we design street parking? Like, can I get a blue space in front of my house kind of a thing? Potentially, but if a space is marked as accessible or blue or handicapped, it needs to be fully compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which means things like slope, spacing, loading area, et cetera. In most of these cases, that's not feasible. But there might be cases where it makes sense. And if someone in your home uses a wheelchair and you need that blue curb or something like that, it's an option, it's a tool in the toolbox, but we've got to make sure we're meeting our other standards as well. Is there patrolled parking lot for residents? JR, we are happy to look into that. There's a lot of details there we need to explore, but Mary, can you make a note of looking into any potential places we might be able to create some parking lot space?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the maps are currently posted, and I will throw this link, or Mary, can you throw that link in the chat for me? Because I can't copy it out of the slideshow. But it's an interactive map, so you can zoom in and out. Again, constant work in progress, so there might be a small section of this map that's outdated, but these are available so that you can look at those and give us any additional feedback. A lot of questions about Jewel Street. So Mary, I think maybe some site visits out to Jewel. And if there's a resident or two from Jewel that can take the lead for that area, and maybe we can set up a street meeting or something like that. Mary mentioned Union already. Yep, Union, couple Union questions. So I would say too, one of that overflow challenge is certainly there. Like I said, we've tried to find creative ways where on some of the wider streets, maybe we can convert into 45-degree angle spots to create more parking or things like that. And that is potentially where a permitting program comes into play, recognizing our size limitations as they exist. So the widening of the roads question, again, comes down to taking potentially private land and is extremely expensive to implement. I don't know, Lauren, do you know what a block of widening a road by 5 feet would cost off the top of your head? I assume the answer is no, but it's, again, something that if it makes sense in certain places, we are happy to look at it. But there's obviously got to be a lot of resident buy-in and participation. And then there's going to be a larger budgeting and environmental review. So anyone that's near creeks or other waterways, that's another challenge.
Yeah, that's right, Quinn. And with Public Works, we have a capital improvement program that we run, and everything's based on priorities, and they're ranked against other projects in the city. So it would depend on how a widening a road would score against a lot of other projects. And then the last thing along with waterways is drainage. It's, it's not as simple as adding a few feet of width that, you have to look for drainage patterns and stuff for when we do get rain.
Thanks, Lauren. But again, if there is sincerely a road where it's like every ounce of parking feels like it has to be eliminated, and that's a road to look at, again, it's a conversation we're happy to have. There might have to be an interim solution that doesn't feel as good. But again, we're entertaining these.
So the concept of angled parking, I'll let Lauren take over, but there are specifications for angled parking, and from our experience of analyzing it, it does require more space in terms of length. So you want to speak a little bit?
Thanks, Mary. We did consider this for a street. I forget the name. It was north of 4th Street, but angled parking is a bit of a space hog still. Just when you have cars, like you think you save some length or whatever, but you really don't. An angle, a regular parallel parking space is say 18 feet at shortest. And when you look at the length of an angled parking space, it still takes like 16 feet. So it really doesn't add that many spaces. But then it juts a lot more into the street. So we couldn't make it work. And I'm not sure there's a lot of opportunities on these narrow hillsides.
We're happy to evaluate it, but at the end of the day, sometimes it doesn't work in our favor, but we always try.
Yeah, so a lot of these, we hear the questions and the concerns, some support for a Jewel meeting. So again, if someone could, I don't know if Jewel has an existing kind of neighborhood association or a list or anything like that. But if we can find a way to get in touch with those folks directly, or we can go through the neighborhood association and schedule something like that, or Mary can just set up a time to be out in the neighborhood. Happy to do that. Yeah, and I would say too, in some areas, I think we alluded to this, but to be clear, like when we had to make decisions that like saying park on one side of the street versus the other, one of the first considerations is which side can handle more parking based on driveways and things like that. And then the other consideration is we want people parked towards their evacuation route. So we will do what we can to make to have as much parking as possible, but that evacuation route and having people park the right way is the other thing. And I do appreciate the comments of support and understand the comments of concern. And we continue to dive more and more into this. Lauren, there's a couple questions about speed bumps. Can you quickly address that process?
Sure. Speed bumps right now aren't supported by all departments of the city, so it's not really a solution we look into. We've got a few streets where we're actually looking at removing them. So we try to use our other tools in the toolbox before looking at speed bumps.
And I can say specifically on the engine and the ambulance side is you've got to slow down a lot for on a speed bump, and that can impact stuff in that sense and has vehicle impacts. But again, tool, but thanks, Lauren, I appreciate that. I don't think I missed any specific questions. I didn't read every comment. Councilmember Bushy, do you have anything you wanted to add? Not to put you on the spot, but certainly wanted to give you the opportunity if there was anything.
Oh, thanks so much, Quinn. You always do such a thorough job, and the rest of Mary and Lauren have done an excellent job laying out this process and showing the level of detail and objective analysis that went into this. But I want to step back a little bit and make 2 points to the residents. One is to identify an area I think they should put more energy into, and the other is to identify an area that I think is not a likely avenue of success. The first one, put more energy into. That is to look at your own properties and see if there are ways to expand areas or to come up with off-street parking that you can add that is on your property, bearing in mind that this will be your own private parking spot. So if you can do as that photo showed of, just about 6 feet of gravel with a short retaining wall, that can be enough. And then you get to put up a private parking sign there, that's yours. So, and we are very open to looking at if there are exceptions that need to be made, variances that need to be granted. We're open to discussing those to figure out ways that we can help you make more parking on your property so that you don't have to worry about this. So please put more energy into that. Put on your thinking caps, get out there. If you need some help, contact us, and we can come out and give you some ideas of how that would work. So that's the area I'd like to see more attention put into. The topic I don't think is a good use of your time is considering ideas for tearing out sidewalks to replace it with parking. Just the safe routes to schools, that just as far as I'm concerned, that is enough of a reason to keep the sidewalks there. And we are trying as a population to address climate change goals, which is to encourage more walking and less motor vehicles. So I don't think, of course, I can't speak for the entire council, but I don't believe it would be a likely scenario where the city would agree to tear out sidewalks and to replace it with parking. So to wrap up, I think Quinn, as always, and the rest of the crew has done just an absolutely great job of laying out what this is. The particular issues on Jewel, I understand that they are acute. Let's get out there and be as creative as we possibly can as to what we can do there to maintain safety, but allow as much parking as is feasibly possible in that area. And then come up with every idea you can think of. We should have a competition for the neighborhood. Who can have the most creative off-street parking to make this work? So Quinn, back to you. Great job, team.
Thank you, council member. Jim, I know you put this in the chat a couple of times, and in terms of the data, one of the reasons we can't answer that question is we can't count parking that's illegal. So I can't tell you how much parking we're eliminating because I don't have a way of assessing the parking in areas where, like, I can tell you that we have this many roadways that are this wide. And so in theory, they're this long and an average vehicle is this, but they're not parking spots, right? It's just a street. So I understand the concern about that. I will say we almost had the reverse challenge on San Rafael Lincoln Hill, which again was our initial pilot, the first one implemented, where we've actually had people come back and say, we feel like you installed too many parking boxes in terms of like that turn is now tricky or something like that. So I do think we are, again, doing our best to create as much legal and safe parking as possible. But it's street parking is not like the street parking downtown where it's metered spots and there's lines. Like we can count those parking spots. We can't count some of these neighborhood streets where people are half in gravel, half not. So I understand it. We'll see what other numbers and hard data we can try to come up with that'll be along those lines. It won't fully address the question you're asking. Again, Mary mentioned Marin Maps. It's a public resource, and Mary can probably put the link for Marin Maps in the chat. And you can go look at all the street measurements if you want yourself. And we've put all the neighborhoods that we've started the evaluations on, the full street list, as well as the streets, and their widths according to Marin Maps. But going back to that, the streets vary, they're not 100%. And that's why that on the ground truthing, if you will, is so important, and why we're so appreciative of the time staff and our engine companies have put into going out and looking at these places to find the littlest nuance we can to establish a safe parking spot or something like that. I did not stop our recording during the questions, but nobody asked verbal questions. We are happy to hang out and handle any additional questions. I do want to recognize, I think we had 7:30 set as our end time. So if anyone wants to unmute, I can stop recording now if someone has a verbal question they want to ask. I think we've addressed them all, and I think that is
I have a question.
the end of our slides. Yeah, do you want me to stop the recording? Do you care?
You don't have to. You don't
Okay.
have to.
Go ahead.
It's something that has not been addressed. There are a number of streets. I can name a number for you, but I think you'll know what I'm talking about. They weave in between the city and the county, the unincorporated portion of the county, and you people only enforce and deal with what is inside the city. As an example, West Seaview, it's 5/8 of a mile long. There are two sections of it within the county, one section that's within the city. The two sections in the county are at the ends. So no matter what you do, if you're dealing with evacuation, emergency evacuation, or getting an emergency vehicle in, if you don't get the ends of those streets, it doesn't matter what you do in the middle of that street. So how are you addressing that question?
Yeah, Fred, that's a great question. And I saw Mary must have got booted real quick. Mary, if you can put the link to Marin Maps in the chat, so folks can look at the map if they're interested, that'd be helpful.
Mary's computer overheated.
Oh, okay. Oh, I think she just got back in. I just readmitted her, so hopefully she, if not, we'll get that out via. But Fred, to your question, so I guess the good news is the way the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority is designed is San Rafael is one zone. And the San Rafael zone does not pay attention to the city-county boundaries. So those nuances that you're talking about as a zone do not apply. So the project work we can do and the money that we can invest does not have to be San Rafael specific. When it comes to enforcing something like roads and traffic, parking tickets, that is a challenge, but we did vegetation management work across city boundaries because the funding was for the whole zone. So that includes things, Santa Benicia, Bayside Acres, Country Club, and then all those little, or Los Ranchitos, et cetera, those little places you mentioned. So,
but specifically, the written notice we received indicated that you were only making changes within the boundaries of the city, and it specifically excluded the county portion.
Yeah, so, for the parking, that's what's within our control. I think that is one of our next steps, is to start looking at that. I do believe the evacuation study that is now happening countywide will stem from that. So my hope is, like, this time next year, you're going to ask me that same question, and I'm going to tell you the specific plan we have in place. But we're taking the steps and we're doing the things that we can control while we work on these bigger issues moving forward.
Okay. The second question I have is, while I understand that there are decisions that have been made for many of the streets, for again, using West Seaview as an example, they have not been implemented because of a shortage of poles.
Yes.
What's
So for everybody's awareness, the supply chain is also impacting traffic signs and road signs. And that is happening here as well. We actually just had some folks, I think it was from the West End, Mary, correct me if I'm wrong, well, the area doesn't matter, basically say, I thought you guys were already going to install this, whereas we're waiting on our vendor to produce all this material. So we might end up, having to do some red curbing, even though we want to long-term install signs because they're more permanent and easier to understand and at height. So yes, there are supply chain issues with this installation. We will not start any type of enforcement or warning system until it's installed. So we've got our initial order in.
Can we assist?
Do you have aluminum poles and traffic signs? I love it.
I can probably acquire them.
Can you please connect with Mary and Lauren, because this is a very real challenge right now.
I know, that's why I'm raising it.
I appreciate it, and costs also went up a lot with it.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So let's see what we can do here. Okay, I'll contact you guys. Yes.
Appreciate it.
Good.
Eucalyptus. Oh, we're way off parking now, but we're here, so let's do this.
Do you want me to take over?
I can handle eucalyptus, okay. Mary, it's fine. The short answer is it's a work in progress. It really depends on the health and the maintenance of the eucalyptus. Actually, and many of you have probably been up there, right? The fire road that runs back behind the canyon. We did a eucalyptus removal project probably about 10 years ago. And now we've got all of these sprouts coming out of the stumps that are probably more dangerous than the mature tree was in the first place. So one of our biggest hurdles with eucalyptus removal is we need to be able to topically and specifically treat the stumps with some type of herbicide so they don't grow back. There is a large environmental review process there. There's obviously going to be a lot of public feedback on that. But to really get rid of the eucalyptus, we've got a big challenge there that we're working on. It is in our work plan for the coming year to pilot a project. And so we are, it is on the radar. We are trying to find the most hazardous eucalyptus first, and we're doing a lot of understory work. So while you might not see us removing full mature trees, which in some cases are not a large hazard, we are making sure we're doing our best to clean up the understory of that, all the duff, and remove the lower limbs. To Glenn's question, we would need to look specifically. There might be some places we could remove eucalyptus. We'd have to have a reason beyond parking to remove a mature tree, assuming it's maintained and healthy. So there's definitely questions there, but we are looking at eucalyptus around the city. I think we've done one small eucalyptus removal project to date off of Point San Pedro, I believe, but don't quote me on that. So totally hear it. It's one of many things we're working on. Appreciate that. Susan sent me a direct question. End of Hacienda Court. And Susan, I know you and I have talked about this, and Mary and I talked about it a little more offline today too, in terms of that. But the question ultimately is, removing parking to assure turning radius for vehicles. It's really going to depend on how that engine operates. It doesn't have to be one complete turn, but we get into 3, 4, 5-point turns. Again, safety hazards, getting folks and ambulances out quickly, things like that. So we are going to follow up with you on some of the other ideas that Mary and I chatted about a little more in depth. But that, I hope that addresses that.
There will be another drive-by of Hacienda, so we're going to see what the turning radius is in both directions at that point.
If we do, I like the tri-tip idea. We'll do a dinner to do eucalyptus removal. I'm not even sure a tri-tip dinner will be enough.
Excuse me.
Go ahead, yes.
As a compliment to fire, I'm a longtime now retired police chief in the county here. Mary Beth, thank you for the council's backing on this. I've been on Dominican Drive for 35 years and I've been waiting for this to happen. I've seen fires in my city. I've seen fire trucks not be able not only to get in, but certainly to get out. It's a hazard for firemen. It's a hazard for people trying to escape. Oakland had 3,000 homes burned. I don't even know how many were in Santa Rosa. And if you don't think it can happen to you and can happen here, it can. And thank you, fire, for taking an initiative and a step forward before something happens rather than trying to mitigate something after it did. And I, for one, as a longtime individual in law enforcement, appreciate fire and appreciate what you've done. You're not going to get everybody who's going to be on your side on this, but you've got a lot of people who really are.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And we know it's a tricky one. It's not easy. And I think a lot of folks too, they recognize it as the big picture. And when it's the parking spot that they use every day, it feels a lot more personal. And we totally get that. And to the council members' point, the more I think off-street parking we can create and some of these other ideas, whether it be lots or other things, I'm happy to look at. I do just want to make sure everybody sees, I just put in a email. It's SRFD, San Rafael Fire Department .dspace, as in defensible space, at cityofsanrafael.org. So if you have a specific eucalyptus you want us to look at, if you want a vegetation inspection, if you want information about chipper days, which are upcoming, I don't have the list in front of me to tell you when yours is, but all of that, email that, let them know what your need is, and it'll get routed to the right person on staff that's dealing with that issue. We are here to support you, and we're really grateful too. We do have an arborist as well as a forester on staff. So when it comes to these bigger projects and these landscape changes, we're working on those as well. And I saw a hand. JR, do you have something?
Hi, I'm also Tamala Fish, and
Hey,
I
how
just
are
want to
you?
say I'm Heidi. I'm here with JR. And I'm not a politician, but I wanted to mirror what the politician said as a resident who's been affected by everything you just mentioned. I had to cut down 20 trees. I did it by myself with a chainsaw because I couldn't completely afford the vegetation management. Or I mean, I couldn't afford to hire a person to do it, but vegetation management did come out and really help me completely chip up and take away those trees. And that made it possible for me to afford. So I did utilize that program, and and there's negatives to it as well. My house was much hotter today and I didn't cut those trees because they were the south, they're the shade I needed. I see a lot of my neighbors from Hacienda Court, Glen Park. Parking's been tough around here for a long time. I'm so happy to hear you guys say again and again that you're going to talk with us. And I heard you repeat that to many people, and I know we'll be calling you as well. But to everybody on my street, specifically in Glen Park, I am the person that lives at the trailhead and where that blind curve is. I mean, a lot of you down the street know me because I am a parking horrible person. I take it upon myself. I used to put notes constantly on the windows of the car because the garbage truck stopped picking up my garbage for a little bit because it had a hard time getting through and stuff. There are people that used to go up the trailhead and park their cars, and we couldn't find them, to get their keys, and they didn't realize they're blocking the entire fire road. And beside me is a home where an elderly person used to live, and now is apartments into a lot of people that seems to have a lot of medical emergencies. The fire truck has to come there a lot, and we have seen them have big problems, and we've had to go find neighbors to have them move the cars so they can get in and out. I mean, I'm losing parking spots. I'm losing my shade. I am being directly affected by this, but I mean, I really need it. I need it. And I am happy it's happening and not just me trying to do it myself. So I look forward to talking to you more, and I understand everybody's saying in the comments, but I think once we've had a time to kind of think it through and kind of process it a little bit. I have a teenager. I need to move a car. I am one of those people. I can't fit all the cars I need in my driveway. And I do use my full driveway. And I tried to park someplace a little bit farther away, but we had everything stolen, But I also heard you very clearly say that enforcement is a huge part of this again and again. And I think when people start seeing that, that will change a lot. I think they'll really see how when the streets are opened up, how you can move through there a little bit easier. And there's stuff that's not happening that used to happen. So sorry to take so much time, but I feel like I'm really at the nexus of this, you guys. And I have screamed and yelled too, but now I'm over it and wanting to save my house.
I appreciate it. And it is, I think what you're hearing more and more is not preparing or mitigate fire. It's really adapting, right? We know our reality. We've had 5+ ignitions in the last couple of weeks in the county. For those of you that are on Pulse Point, you've seen those pop up. Any one of those with the wrong weather conditions is changing a lot of people's lives. And we want to prevent that as much as we possibly can and keep everybody as safe. And we know these changes are making a difference. And it doesn't mean that change isn't hard. I'm a Marin resident as well. I get it, right? But it is, I hope, for the better public good, and appreciate everyone's feedback. And so I think we've got a few specific roads and addresses and areas to follow up on, and I'm sure Mary will get a few more emails from other folks as well. We've got a few other things to look into in terms of potential parking lot spaces or other things like that. We've got some resources up for you here. We'll provided the chipper link as well for those of you that are interested in the chipper days. It's a great free resource. We have our grant program link here. If you need financial help, and I think the question came up, will we help? I see no reason why this mitigation grant could not help you. It's not going to be a huge dollar figure, but it could certainly go to helping you offset the costs associated with creating off-street parking, because that mitigates the risk to the community. So I'm fully in support of that. But those grants can also help you with your vents, any vegetation removal that meets our standards, things like that. We've also got our direct assistance program. So if you can't do it, or if the work's too big for the grants, or you don't have the money up front, we've got people that you can sign a quick form and we'll come to your property and probably can do the majority of work. It's a great crew, Fire Foundry, that's working with TAM Crew. They've been doing a lot of work in open space for us as well. And I think we've done 40 or 50 homes with them to date this year alone. So we're excited about this. The concern about vehicle safety, we hear it. We'll make sure, parking services is under PD, and we'll make sure we're working with PD on this. I can't speak to property values and other things, but I can speak to how wildfire impacts property values, and that's certainly not something we want to see, and we want to continue to keep everybody safe. I wish we could make this. They have gotten a little bit skinnier. The catch is we also have reserve trucks. I love that question. I'll have to ask one of our engineers, can you make this truck skinnier? Some of our older trucks in reserve are bigger. But that is something that over time, I think you will see is smaller apparatus. But those are not cheap vehicles, and it takes us time to replace our fleet. And so we're working through that slowly, obviously over time as we replace things. There's also some really fancy ones that turn back wheels that are on like totally different nexus. So they kind of do that, like the wheels can turn 90 degrees to do different types of turns. I think they have one somewhere in Southern Marin. So there's things out there, but all come with right costs, benefits, all that good stuff. So again, appreciate everyone's feedback this evening. Seeing no other pressing questions or hands or comments, we are here for you. This is not the end of the conversation by any means. Please reach out to us. Let us know what we can do. I think that's our last slide. Yep, with the resources. And hope everybody has a great evening. And again, feel free to reach out with anything else. We are here for you.